esteem. Let's start with something most people don't realize until they've lived it. When you set a boundary with a narcissistic person, you think you're doing something reasonable, esteem. You think you're saying, this doesn't work for me, or I'm not comfortable with that, or even something as simple as, please don't speak to me that way. In healthy relationships, esteem, that's called communication. In a narcissistic dynamic, that's called a threat, because what a boundary really does, and this is the dangerous truth, esteem, is expose the fragility underneath the grandiosity. Narcissism isn't strength, it isn't confidence, it isn't power. It's a very brittle shell built around a deeply unstable sense of self, esteem. Their identity depends on control, admiration, compliance, and the ability to define reality. When you go along with them, when you accommodate, when you stay quiet to keep the peace, esteem, their system works, the illusion holds. But the moment you say no, you disrupt that system. Your boundary says, esteem, you are not entitled to unlimited access to me. And entitlement is oxygen to a narcissistic personality. So when you limit it, they don't experience that as a neutral request. Esteem, they experience it as rejection, as disrespect, as humiliation, as betrayal. That's why the reaction can feel so disproportionate. You ask for basic decency and you get rage. You ask for space and you get accusations. You calmly explain your limit and suddenly you're too sensitive, selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful, esteem. What's happening in that moment is exposure. Your boundary forces them to confront something they cannot tolerate, the idea that they are not in control, that they are not superior, esteem, that they are not unquestionable. And here's where it gets even more complex. Many narcissistic individuals genuinely believe they deserve special treatment, esteem. They don't see their demands as excessive. They see your limits as unfair. So when you assert yourself, it destabilizes their carefully curated self-image. Instead of reflecting, esteem. Instead of adjusting, they defend, they attack, they deflect. You might walk away thinking, maybe I said it wrong. Maybe I should have been gentler, esteem, maybe I overreacted. But notice how quickly you begin questioning yourself. That's part of the dynamic, esteem. The intensity of their reaction is so strong that you start shrinking your own reality to calm them down. And over time, that's how people disappear inside these relationships, esteem. Not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly through 1,000 swallowed boundaries. So understand this: when you set a boundary and it's met with hostility, esteem, you are not witnessing strength. You are witnessing fragility under threat. You are seeing how dependent the dynamic was on your silence. A healthy person may not love your boundary, esteem, but they will respect it. A narcissistic person sees it as exposure, and exposure feels dangerous to someone whose entire identity is built on control. So if your simple no causes chaos, esteem, that tells you everything you need to know, because a boundary doesn't create the instability, it reveals it. Now, once you understand that a boundary exposes their fragility, esteem, the next piece becomes painfully clear. You cannot expect respect. You have to expect backlash. This is where so many people get blindsided. You finally gather the courage to say, esteem, this isn't okay, or I won't tolerate that anymore. And somewhere inside you, there's hope. Maybe this time they'll understand. Maybe this time they'll hear you, esteem. Maybe this time things will change. But with a narcissistic personality, boundaries are not invitations for growth. They are triggers, and the backlash can take many forms, esteem. Sometimes it's explosive, yelling, intimidation, threats, dramatic rage. Other times it's icy and calculated, the silent treatment, withdrawal of affection, shutting down communication, esteem. And sometimes it's subtle and manipulative, guilt-tripping, playing the victim, telling others how hurt they are by your sudden cruelty. Notice the pattern, esteem. The focus shifts immediately away from your boundary and onto their emotional reaction. You say, please don't insult me. They respond, I can't believe you think I'm a bad person, esteem. You say, I need space tonight. They respond, wow, after everything I do for you. You say, don't go through my phone. They respond, if you didn't have anything to hide, esteem, this wouldn't be a problem. What just happened? The original issue disappears. Now you're defending yourself. Now you're soothing them. Now you're apologizing for having a need, esteem. That's the dangerous pivot. Narcissistic backlash is designed, consciously or unconsciously, to train you. It teaches you that boundaries equal chaos, boundaries equal punishment, esteem, boundaries equal emotional exhaustion. And over time, your nervous system learns that it's safer not to set them at all. That's how control deepens. And let's talk about something even harder, esteem. Sometimes the backlash isn't loud. Sometimes it's charming. They might suddenly love bomb you, become attentive, agree temporarily, promise change. For a moment you think, worked, esteem. But if there's no sustained accountability, if the pattern quietly returns, that wasn't respect, that was strategy. Healthy people might struggle with a boundary at first, esteem. They might need clarification, they might even feel uncomfortable. But they don't punish you for having one. They don't try to destabilize you for protecting yourself. When backlash shows up, esteem. It's data. It tells you that the relationship was functioning on imbalance. It tells you your compliance was part of the glue holding it together. And this is where courage comes in, esteem. Because once you see the backlash, you can't unsee it. You have to decide whether you'll interpret it as proof that you were wrong or proof that your boundary was necessary, esteem. If someone responds to your self-respect with retaliation, that reaction is the evidence. Because respect doesn't explode when challenged, control does. Once you've seen the backlash, esteem. Something else starts to happen, the illusion begins to crack. And this is where boundaries become incredibly powerful, even if they're uncomfortable, esteem. Because boundaries don't just provoke a reaction, they break the illusion of control. Narcissistic relationships operate inside an unspoken contract. They set the tone, esteem. They define what's acceptable. They decide when there's conflict and when there isn't. Over time, you may not even realize how much of the emotional climate has been dictated for you. Esteem, you adjust, you anticipate, you manage their moods, you filter your words, you shrink your needs, and it happens slowly. But when you set a boundary, you interrupt that rhythm, esteem. You introduce something foreign into the system, autonomy. You're no longer reacting, you're choosing. And that shift is destabilizing for someone who relies on control to feel secure, esteem. Because control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle. It shows up as love bombing in the beginning, overwhelming affection, attention, intensity that sweeps you off your feet, team. It shows up as gaslighting later, making you question your memory, your perception, your sanity. It shows up as future faking, esteem. Grand promises about what's coming one day, to keep you invested. It shows up as triangulation, bringing in other people to create jealousy, insecurity, or competition, esteem. All of these tactics serve one purpose: maintain dominance over the emotional narrative. When you set a boundary, those tactics become visible. You start noticing patterns, esteem. You start recognizing how often your discomfort was minimized. You start seeing how frequently your needs were reframed as flaws. And that awareness is threatening, esteem. Because once you see the system, you can't fully participate in it the same way again. I often tell people that boundaries act like light in a dark room. The furniture was always there, esteem. The sharp edges were always there. But once the light turns on, you stop walking into things blindly. And here's the part that can feel disorienting, esteem. Sometimes the narcissistic person will double down when the illusion cracks. They may intensify the charm, or escalate the manipulation, or become colder and more dismissive, esteem. It's an attempt to restore the previous dynamic, the one where you were less aware and more compliant. But the moment you say, no, esteem, that doesn't work for me, you've stepped outside the script. You're no longer playing the role that sustains their control. And that's when clarity begins to replace confusion, esteem. You start realizing that the chaos wasn't random. The tension wasn't accidental. The repeated misunderstandings weren't coincidences, esteem. They were part of a system that functioned best when you doubted yourself. So understand this: boundaries don't destroy healthy relationships. They expose unhealthy ones, esteem. When the illusion of control shatters, what's left is truth. And truth may be uncomfortable, but it is always freeing. Because once you see the dynamic clearly, esteem, you stop confusing control with love. Now here's the part that can feel exhausting, even after you've set the boundary, even after you've seen the backlash, esteem. Even after the illusion has cracked, you will be tested repeatedly. And this is where so many people lose their footing, because we tend to think of boundaries as one-time conversations, esteem. You say it clearly, you explain it calmly, and then you assume it will be respected. That assumption works in healthy relationships. It does not work in narcissistic dynamics, esteem. With a narcissistic person, a boundary is often treated like a negotiation, or worse, a challenge. They may ignore it casually at first, almost playfully. You say, don't call me after 10 p, esteem, and suddenly there's a quick emergency in 30. You say, please don't criticize me in front of others. And then comes the joke at the next gathering. When you react, they'll say, esteem, you're too sensitive, or I was just kidding. That's a test. They're checking whether your boundary is solid or symbolic, whether it's real, esteem, or whether it can be bent with just a little pressure. Other times the testing is more direct. They may argue about the boundary itself, debate it, analyze it, esteem, turn it into a philosophical discussion about fairness. Why are you so rigid? Relationships require compromise. You're changing. And here's the psychological trap, esteem. The longer you defend your boundary, the more you start feeling like you're on trial. You begin explaining yourself over and over, justifying, softening, clarifying. And if you give in, esteem, even once, it reinforces the idea that persistence works, that your limits are temporary obstacles, not permanent lines. Consistency becomes everything, not aggression, not hostility, It's not cruelty, just consistency, a calm, repeated, steady response. No, that doesn't work for me. I meant what I said, without over-explaining, without emotional escalation, esteem, without trying to convince them to understand. Because here's the truth, they don't need to understand your boundary to respect it. They need to accept that it exists, esteem. And many narcissistic personalities struggle deeply with that acceptance. They are accustomed to pushing until they get their way. They may have spent years refining that skill, esteem. So when you stop yielding, it disrupts their expectation of how you function. That disruption can feel uncomfortable not just for them, but for you. You may feel guilt, anxiety, fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear that you're being too much. But boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity, esteem. And clarity requires repetition when someone is committed to misunderstanding you. So if you find yourself being tested again and again, don't interpret that as failure, esteem. Interpret it as confirmation that the boundary was necessary in the first place. Because when someone keeps pushing the line, esteem, it tells you exactly how much they benefited from you not having one. A boundary only works if you're willing to hold it, especially when it's inconvenient, esteem. And then we arrive at one of the most painful realizations of all. After the backlash, after the testing, after you've held your ground more than once, something shifts, esteem. You begin to notice a change in how they treat you. The warmth cools. The affection becomes conditional, the approval feels scarce. And that's when the deeper truth starts to surface, esteem. The relationship may have always been conditional. This is the part that breaks people's hearts. Because you thought you were loved for who you are. You thought the connection was mutual, esteem. You thought the closeness meant safety. But when boundaries enter the picture and the relationship deteriorates, you're forced to ask a devastating question: was I valued? Or was I useful? Esteem. Narcissistic dynamics are often transactional. As long as you provide admiration, access, emotional labor, flexibility, silence, things feel relatively stable. Esteem. You may even feel adored at times. But the stability isn't rooted in mutual respect. It's rooted in your compliance. The moment you stop complying so easily, the tone changes. Esteem. You might hear things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the person I fell in love with," or "Why are you making everything so difficult now?" And what they're really saying is, esteem, you're no longer fitting into the role that worked for me. That realization can be disorienting because it forces you to reevaluate memories. Was the affection genuine? Esteem. Were the kind words real? Did they ever truly see me? Here's what's important to understand: the feelings may have felt real in the moment. The charm, the intensity, the connection, esteem, those experiences can be powerful. But when love evaporates the moment you assert yourself, that tells you something critical about its foundation. Esteem. Healthy love expands to include your boundaries. It doesn't collapse because of them. If someone withdraws care, respect, or kindness when you protect yourself, that isn't intimacy unraveling, esteem. It's control losing its grip. And this is where grief enters the process. Not just grief for the person, but grief for the version of the relationship you believed in. Grief for the fantasy, esteem. Grief for the hope that if you just explained yourself better, loved harder, tried more, things would stabilize, esteem. But you cannot earn unconditional respect from someone who only values conditional access. The painful clarity of boundaries is that they reveal who stays when you stop overextending, esteem. They show you who is capable of adjusting and who only functioned when you were shrinking. And that awareness is both heartbreaking and liberating, esteem. Because once you see that the relationship was built on compliance rather than mutuality, you stop blaming yourself for its instability. You stop contorting to win back approval, esteem. You stop confusing their withdrawal with your failure. You begin to understand that the loss of conditional affection is not the loss of love, it's the loss of illusion, esteem. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can realize is this: if someone only loves you without boundaries, they never loved you with them. And after all of this, the exposure, the backlash, esteem, the testing, the painful clarity about conditionality, we have to come back to the most important truth of all. The real danger isn't setting the boundary, it's living without one, esteem. Because yes, setting boundaries with a narcissistic person can trigger conflict. It can trigger withdrawal. It can even cost you the relationship. And that's scary, esteem. No one walks into this lightly. Most people who find themselves in these dynamics have already tried everything else. Being patient, being understanding, being flexible, being forgiving, esteem. You didn't start with boundaries, you arrived at them. And without them, something very quiet but very serious starts happening inside you. You begin abandoning yourself, esteem. It doesn't feel dramatic at first. It feels like compromise. It feels like maturity. It feels like picking your battles. But over time, your preferences shrink. Your voice softens, esteem. Your reactions dull. You stop bringing things up because it's not worth it. You tell yourself you're being strong. But what's actually happening is erosion. Resentment builds, esteem. Anxiety increases. Your nervous system stays on alert. You overanalyze every interaction. You rehearse conversations in your head. You doubt your instincts. You question your memory, esteem. You become smaller so the relationship can remain intact. That's not peace, that's survival, and survival is exhausting. Without boundaries, manipulation becomes normalized. Esteem. Gaslighting becomes confusing instead of alarming. Disrespect becomes something you rationalize instead of challenge. Esteem. You start measuring your worth by how well you can manage someone else's volatility. And here's the hardest part: the longer you stay without boundaries, esteem, the harder it becomes to recognize yourself. You might look in the mirror one day and think, I used to be more confident. I used to be more outspoken. Esteem. I used to feel lighter. That's not random. That's what prolonged self-abandonment does. So when you finally decide to set a boundary, even if it shakes the foundation of the relationship, esteem, you are doing something profoundly protective. You are choosing self-respect over short-term harmony. You are choosing clarity over confusion. You are choosing integrity over appeasement, esteem. Boundaries are not about changing the narcissistic person. That's a battle you will never win. Boundaries are about defining where you end and someone else begins, esteem. They are about protecting your time, your energy, your emotional well-being. And if the relationship cannot survive your self-respect, that tells you something essential, esteem. Conflict is uncomfortable. Loss is painful. But losing yourself slowly, quietly, over years, that is far more dangerous. So if you're standing at that crossroads, esteem, afraid that setting a boundary will create chaos, ask yourself this: what has not setting one already cost me? Because in the end, boundaries don't destroy you, esteem. They protect who you were before the manipulation ever began.